Get your mother-loving ears on because your big-time radio DJ's got news. PayPal lets you choose how you want to pay for all the stuff. With PayPal, I can pay in-store, pay online, or pay over time. What's that? You want this translated into song? I hope you're sitting down. You can pay your own way. You keep those ears on, you hear? Don't just pay, baby. PayPal.
Learn more at paypal.com.
This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. Healthcare professionals can lead their careers with LinkedIn. Discover jobs by specialty, preferred shifts, and even desired salary. From mental health therapists to radiology technicians, it's now faster and easier for healthcare professionals to find the right fit. Learn more at linkedin.com/healthcare. Side effects may include faster job placement, improved work-life balance, and increased career satisfaction.
This episode is brought to you by Nature's Bounty. Nature's Bounty believes your body is brilliant, naturally designed to thrive, inside and out. For those always looking for new ways to support your health from head to heels, Nature's Bounty has a range of over 400 vitamins and supplements born from 50 years of trust and care. Nature's Bounty. It's in your nature. Visit naturesbounty.com to learn more.
Welcome to this week's episode of Safe Room, a horror gaming podcast and proudly part of Bloody FM, Bloody Disgusting's podcast network. I'm your host, Jay Krieger.
And I'm the other one, Neil Bolt.
And this week, we're chatting about the horrors of the Maw in developer Tarsier Studios and publisher Bandai Namco's 2017 horror platformer, Little Nightmares. Playing as a mysterious girl 6, players explore a mysterious underwater vessel called the Maw, filled with the strange denizens and gargantuan monsters looking to add you to their chopping block. So in the 5 years that we've been yapping collectively about games, we've yet to cover the Little Nightmares series. So, why not double book our week of episodes with a, all things Tarsier Studios, which is a short preview for this Thursday's episode of Horror Bites is an interview that I conducted with Tarsier Studios co-founder Andreas Johnson and the narrative director Dave Mervick about their up-and-coming game Reanimal. Got a lot of cool insight, not only the studio's approach to, a spiritual successor to the Little Nightmare series, but also just getting more insight into, approach to horror storytelling. Neil, do you have much experience with this series? And if so, what is your sort of impression of it?
Yeah, so it came at like a weird time for me. Like as much as I was playing horror games, I wasn't like I wasn't the horror guy at this point. It was part of my wider job, reviewing all sorts of things. So I don't know, it kind of pushed by me, I think, at the time, which is understandable. There's a lot of games out there, and I covered a fair few, but. Yeah, so I think obviously it was just a year before I started Bloody Disgusting, but obviously then you had to ramp up for the sequel. I don't know, I played some, and then I was like, okay, like that. It's one of those games at the time, when you have lots of money and no time, sort of thing, where you buy a lot of stuff, play 10 minutes, then forget to go back to it again and again. Yeah. But yeah, I think I played it just before the sequel came out with the intention of, playing that, and which I didn't at the time. And yeah, it was like, okay about it. But, by that point, Inside had been a thing. And we talked about how much, we love Inside. And obviously there's a lot of similarities in terms of like tone and like puzzling and the sort of 2.5D nature of both of those games. I was strangely, okay with it. Like that. I kind of respected its place, it being this game that, in terms of horror, like it connected with a much wider audience, and it was clear to see why. But yeah, obviously for this, when we were talking about doing this, like the enhanced version came out with the release of Little Nightmares 3, which is obviously by Supermassive, not by Tarsier, and yeah. I gained a new appreciation for it because in doing this as well, I ended up playing the DLC as well, the Secrets of the Maw. which we'll probably go into a bit later when in talking about the story. But yeah, I've come to appreciate a lot about. I think it's the ambiguity of some things, even though more and more got explained, I think, as the series went on, that kind of makes it so intriguing. Probably got it such a fandom to begin with. So yeah, it's been weird for considering all the sort of boxes we've ticked in terms of horror games over the years, especially on here. And this is one of those big blinking lights, in terms of like things we haven't covered. So it's a good, as you say, good timing. Yeah, that we cover it.
Yeah, I think we had briefly mentioned, the series in an episode that we covered. We were covering the topic of, combatless horror games, which the more that we delve into, horror and genre, it was one of those things where it's like, oh, okay, let's highlight some games that kind of like defy the typical expectations of horror, right? Because the first thing most people probably think about with horror games is like survival horror, which combat is a huge part of that. But there has also been this wave naturally of horror games that it's mostly based around stealth or, running away, if you will. And so, we kind of briefly touched upon, I think, Little Nightmares in that regard and that approach. But I think that over the years since that conversation, getting to not only play through the original game, once or twice, but also then playing into the sequel, it kind of, I think it reinforced something that I talked about with the developers in that chat that's going to drop on Thursday. And I promise that I'm not going to keep referring to that the entire episode. But I think that, it was really insightful because of the fact that since playing the original game, it further made me kind of appreciate aspects of the design that I think kind of like, again, circumvent those expectations. Like the fact that the game, Little Nightmares, has a distinct lack of exposition, right? And there's no voiceover, there's no exposition, there's like no diary entries, these kind of like typical horror storytelling facets that we're used to with the genre. And it really forces the game's art direction and like environmental storytelling, if you will, to be quite strong. And I think that is one of the aspects of the Little Nightmare series that kind of still stands out, in addition to, you playing as this defenseless child and it giving a little more credence to the notion of, well, of course there's not going to be combat. You're a little kid and these are gargantuan monsters and there's no combat. And so there is sort of a facet of that as well, where the developers don't even really have the option of that old standby of like the super soldier, if you will, or the everyman that all of a sudden becomes this hardened killing machine. And I think that that nature of it kind of like further reinforces that Little Nightmares kind of like identity that's developed over the course of the first two games. I haven't played the third one, so I can't speak to that. But in terms of, Tarsier Studios' approach to these games, I think that that's still one of the aspects of its design that really holds up. I guess in talking about, combatless horror games, we could do a little bit of backtracking there, I suppose, because this game was released around the time, it's really like the heyday of acclaimed horror games that didn't feature combat, such as Inside, Layers of Fear, Oxenfree, even the likes of Detention, right? Those are all really notable examples of combatless horror. But for you, I suppose, like, how does Little Nightmares most meaningfully contribute to that sort of realm of horror?
I think you've kind of mentioned it in the context of the protagonist being a child and the threat being adults whose sole wish is to effectively eat children, like that in this way, and everything being designed in that way. It's got that sort of, if you will, adult perspective via childlike sort of wonder. If you think of anything like Roald Dahl, for instance, like that sort of, or even like Jean-Pierre Jeunet's The City of Lost Children, stuff like that, where it's like you get a childlike sort of nature to it, but also kind of funneled. You've got this adult thing to it that kind of taps into the sinister things. And I don't know, I think about it in terms of like my daughter is fascinated by horror in certain ways, and a lot of the things she's fascinated by are these sort of pursuit sort of encounters, things like that. When you think back to your own childhood, that's like a common theme, I think, in terms of probably the things we're told, in terms of like you could be kidnapped, people could come after you, sort of thing like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's what's wonderful about the idea behind it, is that you do just, and the relative size as well being like exaggerated, and being so small, like compared to the adults and the environment. It's like, that's especially where it kind of reminded me of Roald Dahl in terms of like the witches, and with the whole thing of them being mice in that for a bit, and having to go through these environments and it being doubly dangerous, and humans out to kill them even. So yeah, I really think that's a strong thing to go with in a time when, like you said, we had so many games going with that way, and we were just about to sort of hit the reset button on horror in terms of games, where Resident Evil was coming back to the fore properly and as a horror game and stuff like that. So yeah, it had to do a lot to stand out, and I think it is that sort of touchstones that we've talked about, like Roald Dahl, like stuff like Coraline, like that, to get like games like Limbo and Inside as well, kind of evolving on those, which had very sort of simple sort of visual by comparison, very striking. But here, there's more details and little things hidden in shadow, and that sort of 2.5D nature of it as well just adds a bit more, makes it feel a bit more fleshed out, and which, as I've seen with like Reanimal, going kind of a bit further with that now as well, in terms of like shifting cameras and going into and out of the it's like semi 3D by that point. But yeah, there's plenty of reasons I don't imagine it caught fire like it did, but certainly in that sort of subgenre, that would be the one. Sorry, my breath is very short, cold, so I'm gonna keep big breaths on this one.
No worries. Yeah, I think that the aspect of the game's sort of like presentation of its world, and we can kind of return to the thematics that you were mentioning a little bit there in a second, but the notion of being a child, right? And presenting the world in this obviously very exaggerated way, but at the same time, the fact that the world itself is so much larger than you, and naturally that goes along with the monsters and whatnot. But I think that sort of like perspective between the size of 6 and then the environment itself, like really lends to putting, in our cases, adults in the shoes of what it was like essentially to be a child, right? The world is this very scary place, but for the majority of, if you remove the monsters from this game, the environment itself, like for the most part, is pretty straightforward in terms of it being, it's a lot of bedrooms, or it's a kitchen, or, and granted, you're in this, very creepy ship. But I think that overall, generally speaking, like the presentation of the world feels a lot more hostile, even before you get to the monsters, because of that perspective shift. And I think that also lends, just from a gameplay side of things, like mechanically speaking, you get to have those platforming sections and whatnot, but at the same time, you get to have the limitations of a child's strength and whatnot, because they can only carry, basically, you're going to find keys and whatnot. You can only carry one key and you have to hold it in both hands. There's like no inventory. So I found that for this game, like that approach was quite strong in terms of like having a child as the protagonist, because it could be the type of thing where you say, oh, okay, well, we're just a child, because this is the type of thing where it's like you want to basically prey upon the player and wanting them to say like, oh, well, it's a child, so I have to be extra careful, or this and that. But I think that, kind of like going the distance with having a kid as the protagonist is smart, because of the fact that they apply it to basically every aspect, from navigating the world to how you can use stealth to your advantage to get past the monsters, but also in puzzle solving, which, some of those chase sequences that you mentioned are quite tense, but especially the ones that involve you not only running, but then you have to sometimes like push a crate so that way you can basically jump on that to get over a barrier or something. But since the child is very weak and very, small, that very simple interaction can become not cumbersome, but just like a real task for this child to complete, So it's kind of playing with that variable to applying it to gameplay and whatnot, that I think still, is not only a main part of the Little Nightmares identity, but I think overall, like, it just holds up very well.
Yeah, I was thinking, obviously, the other thing that's quite interesting is how it handles like failure
Mm.
in terms of like it is like the title, like waking up from a nightmare each time. Like the bit you died on is effectively just having fallen asleep. That's the
Mm.
way it seems to be explained. Is like Six wakes up like
Yeah.
back at like a checkpoint effectively with a start and like coming out of a nightmare. And I thought that was a really smart way of handling that because I don't know. It's like one of the complaints we've had about many a horror game is like when you die too many times, it kind of dilutes the horror a bit like
Mm.
that. But with that contextually, it's like a really smart decision to sort of give you the idea of like you would in a dream, like you kind of you failed this time, but it kind of like given everything the story as well, like, it's almost like a vision slash dream, like
Mm.
nightmare like that, and kind of maybe you can avoid what you did last time. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's quite intriguing, the idea of just using that sort of nightmare title as like a part of the storytelling and a part of the death system.
Yeah. And, I think that again is one of those aspects that is really unique about this game because of how it complements a story that you're told very little or nothing at all.
Hmm.
Right. And so there's this sort of, I suppose, like this sort of vagueness about the world and about Six and all of these monsters and, the notion of waking up from a dream kind of a thing. But I think that those are all concepts that really do complement one another. And I think that that's something that, we talked about, I talked about with the dev when, Reanimal has voiceover. There's a little bit of
Hmm.
dialogue here and there. And it was one of the aspects of Little Nightmares that I think, again, like when you look backwards from where they came to where they are now, it really does kind of speak to the strengths of those environmental storytellings and whatnot,
Yeah.
especially when, Six begins to encounter the, oddities within this world of the maw and whatnot. Like you come across these like little gnomes that have these little hats and they kind of just like run around and don't really do a whole lot. But at the same time, like it makes you as the player want to know more about them. You're not going to get those
Hmm.
answers, but I think that like just having intriguing things within a world that evoke questions is one of those aspects of storytelling that, we've talked about a lot and how that is, a strength of some games and that they can create these worlds that are very intriguing. And yet the developers and the creatives behind it have the wherewithal to realize like, no, we're going to actually show some restraint here. We're not going to explain everything because as soon as we explain everything, as we've talked about countless times, is whether it's a game or a movie or what have you, like, I don't know, those things become a lot less interesting when you're basically given all the answers. It's like, well, I'm not going to occupy, this isn't going to occupy any space in my brain now because it's like, cool, I got my answer. I'm going to move on. And I think that, for a game like this that doesn't have a traditional narrative, that's exactly the direction that you should be taking. And so I think that ultimately is what makes this world still so mysterious and intriguing. And, without going into talking about the second game, like that's something that's continued in a way that I found to be, really refreshing because of the fact that, as soon as you get into the second game, it's for me, it was the type of thing where I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I want to return to this world where I'm going to be presented with intriguing concepts, intriguing sort of like similarities in some regards. And yet at the same time, everything is not directly spelled out for, players.
Yeah, I mean the sequel's effectively a prequel, is it not? I think. So yeah, so even there it's like not pushing, kind of going round the original story to tell it more of it, if you will, because the DLC is the same. It's like it is a story that runs parallel to Six's story with another child, and basically it ends at part of that story, and in a way that kind of it's probably the biggest revelation I think out of any of it, in terms of like explaining certain things. So I don't want to go into it too much as you haven't played it, and not everyone would have maybe played the DLC, but it does give extra context to some things, and I think it adds an even darker tone to something that is already quite dark as well, which is quite amazing saying that. But yeah, I like the idea of like not really wanting to like push on with a sequel and tell more stories after the fact, but going sort of before and around it at the same time. And yeah, that's a nice way to sort of expand it without sort of over explaining the world.
Yeah, and I think that for me, like what I really love about the original game, and maybe it's to a lesser degree in the sequel, but at the same time, like the sequel does think, well, okay, it's a prequel, but Little Nightmares 2, expands on it in some interesting ways as well. But like in the original game, what I like so much about it is that, it's basically broken up into sections essentially, right? As, 6 further explores Maw, you're visiting these various rooms within this, very strange, massive, sprawling ship. But the monsters that are found within each of the sections, essentially, are reflective of those. So like you have basically like the janitor, right? This blind guy with the massive long arms, and that's basically like a basement kind of seeming section. And then you go into the kitchen and there's this chef, and then, the dining hall, and you've got these massive bloated monsters. And I found for me, like that was ultimately more interesting than just spelling out all of the different answers to questions that I had about the world, because I'm, for starters, I'm preoccupied with surviving. But it gives like more of a sense of identity to environments that, are more or less familiar, but at the same time, like tying the monsters to them in a way that makes it feel like, oh, well, they could only exist in this sort of this world, if you will, or that makes sense why they're here. Because as much as I appreciate like the little gnomes, I think that it's nice that this is a game that is not just like a random amalgamation of fucked up designs, right? That can get a little tiresome sometimes in games, which we've talked about. But I think here what's really nice is that everything feels like it's fitting for where you discover it in this world, which further speaks to just like how demented it is.
Yeah, very much so. It's it's nice to have a little levity in a sort of dark world that it is. It is very, very slight in the grand scheme of things. I think also just the absurdity of like the adults as well just gives it like a dark comedy to it, in terms of like the janitor having long arms and the 2 chefs being like these dull, slow-witted things that, and it's certainly like the level with the guests and just being like some like Henry's directed Spirited Away, kind of thing. It's just a very silly but also kind of terrifying sort of part of the game in terms of like how it's structured, and especially the fact that of all the chase sequences in the game, I think that's the one that really just felt like, oh my god, pure chaos going on in it.
Yeah, they really do a good job, I think, of taking the scares and again applying it to being a child, right? It's not just the fact that you're this small kid in this massive world, whether we're referring to the environment or just the size of the monsters, but also like they utilize that in that sequence you're talking about really well with the guests, where all of a sudden you're quite literally food that's on the proverbial chopping block. And it's like, yeah, they want to grab you and, and do what they want to do, which is eat you. And so like that sort of approach, I think, is one of those things that, again, like that's so much smarter than maybe the traditional approach to scares that we've seen in games that have tried to do things similarly. I think that, again, like it really has a unique way of approaching those types of moments and whatnot. And it utilizes that size throughout. Like it feels very full circle, I think, in terms of just how thoroughly they have planned out, the notion of being a child protagonist. And that's one of those aspects of this game that I think, again, still like really holds up quite well in terms of the presentation of it and whatnot. Because again, the ability to make levels that feel, or I suppose that are fairly routine on paper, but you can do a lot with that when you get to play with things like perspective. The fact that, you can use things as light fixtures as platforms when, you are this miniature child and whatnot. And so that's one of those aspects that really makes this, I think, a strong example of like dark fantasy where, you're operating in that realm of like Coraline, or you had an example previously that is escaping me, but like that approach to horror that kind of captures the feeling and the feeling of fear of just being a child in the world full of adults. But now, like, really taking that to a exaggerated degree is just one of those aspects of this that still, I think, holds up.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely does. And I think by giving it that sort of distinct blocks, of each level effectively, and in such a relatively short running time as well, in terms of like, you can do this in a few hours, pretty much as it is. But yeah, to make each thing feel distinct whilst also part of a whole, that's the tricky part. I think you have in splitting the game up like that, it could end up just feeling like, here's a bunch of ideas that we sort of stapled together the best we could. But no, it's like everything feels like a continuation. It's very difficult to like look at this to not think of Inside, just because of the fact that that came out like the year previous, and thematically a lot of similar things end up happening in both games. But I do just think in like progression from area to area, and like, as you said, because it's not a game telling a worded story, even in the levels themselves, it's like there's not really writing that much. It's mostly about what you can glean from the environment, and that's smartly handled that way, and in terms of breaking these levels up but making them feel like that concrete whole. I suppose the only place where that maybe feels a bit odd is that sort of transition from like the bowels of the ship to getting higher up. I mean, the only reason I think it doesn't end up being a big disconnect is because you have that sort of transitory scene of like climbing on the outside up the chain as the guests are coming in onto the boat, and you kind of do go up, and it's like, it's only then that you sort of go, yeah, now I kind of feel like my journey has been like from the bowels of the ship upwards, completely, in terms of how it's worked. And I greatly appreciated that when it came to the DLC as well, when you're the kid and you're sort of revisiting areas at different times or at the same time, in some cases like that, from a different angle. And it's like, now this all feels, I really feel like the level design working as a whole in a way that I didn't really appreciate entirely the first time around. So it's really smart way to sort of break that up whilst retaining that sort of, like I said, signature identity throughout.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, I guess, in terms of like your progression through the ship. You don't really have that. You're not given those reminders really until, as you said, that section when you get to see the guests boarding the ship and you're like outside on the bows of it. But I think that, again, like what I appreciate about the approach to the platforming aspect of this is that you can use that sense of perspective, but also like the verticality that, when you pair that with the child's size, the higher that you climb in certain environments, and I suppose this also lends itself to this being that 2.5D sort of perspective and how they play with that. In climbing up like a massive shelf, let's say, you can then jump onto the light fixtures, which then sometimes will orient the camera differently. And then all of a sudden, you're taking this environment that, you've been going through, or you more or less, you could say like, oh, okay, well, it's just like a bedroom or something like that, or it's just a kitchen. But the ways in which they play with presentation of environments and the contrast between, the environment and the size of the child, like that kind of thing, I find, again, just like allows them to creatively reinvent certain norms, if you will, for an environment. And I think that the art style itself, like, just does such a great job of pairing the fantastical with, again, the sort of like routine nature of some of those environments. Like, I think about some of those rooms that you're investigating, or you're exploring, and like, you go into it and it's like, sure, it's a room, but then the furniture is like ridiculously high, or the cabinets are like almost touching the ceiling, but it's like a filing cabinet. It's not like just like a china cabinet or a bookshelf. And yet, the ability to kind of like take these staples, take these norms, but then apply that fantastical presentation to like a platforming purpose. I think, again, just like is a really sort of like ingenious way to never let the player forget, like, oh, okay, you are this small thing in this world and you're constantly under threat, but you do have tools at your disposal, even if, they are quite limited. It's more about like facilitating the traversal of this environment in maybe unconventional ways that I think when you have a game such as this that is combatless horror is quite strong once again in that presentation. But we should take a quick break, and when we come back, we can chat more about sort of Little Nightmares' approach to combatless horror, as well as maybe digging a little bit more into the monsters of this world, and at the same time, some of the more memorable moments that we have from this game. But we'll have more on that in a moment.
In Walmart's Who Newville, joy started to grow. For online-only savings sure to steal the show. Tech treats and toys so dazzling and new. Walmart Cyber Monday deal soon ready for you. It's online only with very little time to spare. December 1st will soon be here, so be sure to be there. The Who's are prepared. Are you ready too? A day packed with savings. Amazing! Who knew? Subject to availability, terms and fees apply.
We find Vecna, we end this once and for all, together.
On December 25th.
We have a plan. It's a bit insane. Everyone in?
He knows where we are.
Watch out!
Get ready for one last adventure.
We stay true to ourselves. Stay true to our friends, no matter the cost.
Found you. Stranger Things, Season 5, Volume 2 begins December 25th. Only on Netflix.
Good morning, Crust. It's a great day to be a bread brother.
Ugh, mornings are not my jam. Or jelly.
Oh, come on. Stop loafing around.
I just woke up feeling hollow inside.
Just grab one of the new Morning Uncrustables sandwiches, like Bright Eyed Berry or Up and Apple, filled with 12 grams of protein and tons of deliciousness. Crust, what are you eating?
It's just granola, not even yogurt.
No crust, no fuss. Uncrust your mornings.
And we're back from our break. And I suppose during the break, I was just thinking, like, there is one aspect of the narrative that, again, as we mentioned, like, there's no exposition whatsoever. And the fact that it's very much reliant on environmental storytelling. But, there is an aspect of 6 that I think is probably the best example of, presenting more or less like interesting aspects of the character without spelling anything out. It's all based on physicality. And so in 6's case, periodically she has these bouts of hunger, right? And we see how that grows. And that is almost like the most that we get out of her character in terms of some semblance of a commentary on her condition, her background, what have you. But I always found that was really intriguing. And, it was one of those little things that could have very easily not been included in the game, but I found that it was a great feature about her character because of the fact that it feels so reflective of the world itself. It feels like this is a kid that, is dealing with naturally hunger, but it has the supernatural component to it almost, or a thematic component to it rather. What did you kind of think about that? Those little milestones of hunger that 6 encounters throughout the course of the game?
Yeah, I mean, it'll probably tie into something I was going to say anyway about like the structure of the game as it is. But yeah, you just do get some of the right moments, I think, in terms of where you are in what is the story, which is basically whatever progress you're making forward. And because the game is short enough, you can do it in a few beats. I mean, really, I think it's probably 3-4 hunger sort of little nods that they do, and then sort of culminating in that final, shocking one, if you will. And yeah, I think given everything 6 has learned and we've learned in that journey, it's like having that bit of mystery as to why at that point is a great sort of like mini mystery beyond the why am I here, but it's like what's wrong with me sort of thing. And again, whilst not fully explained, it's like the connotations of it are clearer by the end. And if you're going to have like a central theme to this story, that those hunger pangs are very much it. They are like the thing that have the payoff in terms of when you get to that last act and into that final fight, if you will. So yeah, I think it's peppered through the game at just the right points. Not necessarily just end of level things, which would have been like the easy way to do it, but just usually after you've done something quite stressful, like usually after a big chase or a hard moment, when naturally the hunger might grow and things like that. And I don't know, when you get to that last of like the normal sort of hunger scenes, and it's like, I mean, you can see what's coming. With that, I think at that point, just because I don't know about you, but it's the first thought that came through my head. I don't think Six is eating what's being offered here. It's like, but yeah, I mean, and again, it just leaves these little questions in your head. When you get to the guests thing and how gluttonous they are, and just thinking, okay, well, is this related? What's related to that? And that's the cool thing about it. Very visual storytelling. You are having all these sort of questions answered to a degree, but it's also just filling it up with more, and just that can be frustrating. But I think in a world like this, where it makes it a good reason to go back through it as well and sort of replay it, in a sense where most narrative-driven games of this kind, you've done the story. The only time you're doing it is because you just generally enjoyed the story if you do it again. But having these things that you can sort of come back to and understand, with new insight, and again, the DLC again helped that. I think it really does just keep adding sort of layers to it that show that you don't really need to have like page upon page of exposition and world building if you build the visual side of it so well.
Yeah, and for something that is an action that she is taking, I find that at the end of the day, like, it is a reflection of the world as much of it anything, right? You don't know much about her, so the fact that these things are occurring, I think, is more a commentary just overall, like, on the Maw itself, right? The fact that, it speaks to not only the desperation of our protagonist, and sort of the notion of like survival at any cost, but also like the cycle of, I suppose, like, to a degree, like abuse with it that occurs within the Maw, right? Because she's not the only child, right? You find countless cages, and you find other children, and you find, that one room that's full of, it seems like never-ending piles of shoes from the kids. And then, eating a rat, right? That clearly, that's like a morality check kind of almost, where it's like, if I want to survive, this is what I have to do kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And then there's even, a faithful encounter with a gnome. That's quite notable. And so I think that, it really just kind of like reflects this place as being one that is not only unnatural, but it's also one that really causes people to kind of like be corrupted by evilness within this place. And when you have a game that, again, like doesn't delve into narrative or background in the traditional sense, the Maw itself basically becomes like a character, right? Which sounds very just like...
yeah. I mean, the Maw is very much that. And it goes back to what we were saying about like how everything feels connected, how it feels like a place, because it all makes sense from where you are, but with that sort of visual design being like slightly leaning into the absurd size differences and like over the top character design, it's like, it's like it's so distinct, like to what you get to do and how you do things, and yet it's got like this real world grounding in terms of like, well, as a child, trying to reach door handles, trying to get through windows, things like that, which in normal cases would just be childlike curiosity, but here it's like you say, pure survival. And I think the further you go into the game, the more you sort of start uncovering the story of the boat itself, in terms of like, especially as you go higher at the levels and you see this sort of disparity with where the sausage is made effectively at first, and then seeing where it's going sort of after is it's not quite as wild as say like we're saying with Inside, where that is like that leads to an outcome where you're like, what? Like, where did this come from, sort of thing. But it's like it's still no less grotesque and strange and otherworldly. Yeah, and yeah, it's like I said, it leaves just enough on the table for you to sort of try and sort of ponder. I know obviously Little Nightmares 2 does answer some questions effectively, but not. Yeah, there's still something about that ambiguity as to the whys and the hows of like what 6 ends up doing and can do, and where it ultimately could have gone from there.
Yeah, I think that's why, when I inevitably, learned about the sequel, or it was announced rather, like I was a lot more intrigued than I thought I would be because of the fact that like clearly it was going to be sort of a similar endeavor in terms of like mechanically speaking, right? I think that's fair enough to say about the sequels that it doesn't, and that's not a criticism, but it doesn't necessarily deviate much in terms of like the gameplay approach. However, what returns and what was just as intriguing as I think was in the original, and maybe even to a more so degree, is the fact that it's a world that presents itself in a very strange way, filled with strange creatures and whatnot. And I wanted to learn more about it, but you still are getting that same type of approach and thoughtfulness with crafting those worlds, in that it's a world that's constantly intriguing, even if you're not going to get these concrete answers, which I think, again, is like reinforcing one of the strongest approaches to the original game, and that specific approach ultimately to storytelling and sort of like world building itself. But yeah, just in thinking about the original game now, it's like, yeah, I need to go back and play those DLCs that you've been mentioning, because it's like, yeah, this, I suppose that'll hold me over until I get to dive into Reanimal, a game which, very excited to see kind of like the lessons learned from their time with Little Nightmares 1 and 2. Naturally, Little Nightmares 3, as you stated, is not by, Tarsier Studios, so can't speak to that. But I think that it'll be really interesting to see when we inevitably get around to Reanimal, and just seeing like how they've evolved on that and whatnot. And naturally, I played the demo. I'm not sure if you got to it, but the demo, it felt familiar enough, like it's, like you would expect it to, right? It was more about, I think, the presentation of that world and the introduction of co-op mechanics, which, you might have had a partner following you around in the sequel, but that was a very much still single player sort of affair. So that'll also be the other interesting change for the studio, and the implementation of a game designed with couch co-op or co-op in mind, with puzzle solving and ultimately environmental platforming and puzzle solving in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it brings to mind, actually, the more I think about it, with that sort of evolution of the storytelling nature of Team Ico's games, in terms of Ico and Shadow of the Colossus and Last Guardian, just like they are basically more 3D versions of what you would get here, and especially in terms of like building storytelling as much through what you can see in the world, and there's lots of ambiguity. And I think from what I played Reanimal as well, it's like it feels a lot more like that, in terms, especially in the co-op and the almost eco-like nature of of having the princess around. Yeah, so I'm intrigued by that, and just by worlds that are like apocalyptic in a way that aren't regular, I suppose. Like, I mean, these are dark and dreary worlds, and Little Nightmares probably sensibly contains it to a ship, and that in itself tells a fair bit of the world they're in, but without like expanding too, leaving it too wide. I think that self-contained setting is great, as we've talked about on so many horror games in the past that have like a singular setting. They can do so much work in terms of helping your story grow, especially when you're not going to use a lot of words to sort of push it out there. I think visually it just makes it stronger. I mean, going back to the Spencer Mansion or Talos 1 in Prey, it's so effective to have that, to have something that feels like a space you are connected to in that time and cannot escape from effectively either with these. So, and that's probably then your sort of driving force of your story is that, you know, how do you get out of this? Or how do you get out of this situation? Which is makes it survival horror in that sense. Yeah, like what must you endure? How will you get out? Sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think that for me, like the thing that I'm most excited about with Reanimal also is how the horror will be reflective of you know, the plight of our protagonists, and ultimately it was something that actually I inquired about, but they were, for you know, obvious reasons, didn't want to divulge too much into in terms of like how the monsters themselves are reflective of both the world and also just like the thematic, I suppose, relevance of our protagonist, right? Obviously it wasn't thinking like a one-to-one type of way to influence it, but ultimately like the very distinctly different approach to the monster designs that have been showcased in Reanimal, primarily in like the you know, the media for the game. Like you get to see some really, really fucked up creations and sort of like mutations and whatnot of animals and things along those lines, which aren't explored in the demo. So that's the thing that I'm really excited to see. Because again, like they're very skilled at kind of like taking worlds that, as you stated, are sort of like surreally apocalyptic almost in their construction, but at the same time, you could still kind of identify them. And I'm really interested to see how they're able to back up, narratively speaking, like how these monsters exist in this world and what that does to the world. And obviously people that call that world home and whatnot. I'm also just really excited to see, you know, how the inclusion of voice acting and clearly more narrative is going to influence overall the game, and just sort of like seeing how much of their sort of like Little Nightmares pedigree is retained, and then seeing, you know, the new facets of this game and the sort of like new avenues for both storytelling and an approach to just overall, you know, game design in general.
Yeah, I mean, already like in the demo, there was like one little tiny thing that was like I found quite pleasant in terms of using voices. It's just like the little hush whispered "come here" sort of thing between co-op partners, like that. Just it hits so well. Like it's just that hushed, hurried sort of voice thing. Like, yeah, like when you think of games that, you know, like the dialogue is too loud for what's going on, you know, that you should be heard, sort of thing. Just in the context of the world they're going around in and how dangerous it is, it's like it's great and it just feels right. Little touches like that are really just the sort of thing that help build a world nicely.
And it's those little details, I think, at the end of the day that can potentially open up just like new avenues of storytelling for them, you know, moving forwards, even outside of Reanimal and whatnot for the future. Not to get too far ahead of their releases, but you know, it's one of those things we always love to see. You know, studios pushing themselves and reinventing themselves, which was also something we touched upon. Like, you know, you don't, just because you don't have the Little Nightmares name anymore, you don't just want to end up with something that feels exactly like what you've done previously. And so I think that's what's going to be most exciting ultimately to see. But yeah, as we are wrapping up our chat about Little Nightmares, are there any other aspects of its design or sort of memorable moments that stick with you that we haven't touched upon?
I think we've talked about like the main things in terms of pursuits and how that, you know, as simple as they are, I think it's just the artistic design of them. It really does just help them stand out. And I think the guest sort of chase towards the end of that sort of level is probably my favorite, and visually speaking, especially as well, probably as an audio visual package in general. It just, yeah, it's. You know, it's not trying to be cinematic, if you will, to give that the name, but it does just flow so beautifully. Like, and it's almost annoying when you do fuck up in that one, but it's just. But yeah, that's it. I mean, I suppose just on a tiny sort of downer note, you know, obviously the kind of game it is, and being very puzzle focused. There's a lot of trial and error that, like we discussed, of like how that's handled in terms of, you know, you wake up from the nightmare of what might have been, sort of thing, as an explanation. But yeah, there are some sections where, you know, you've got very limited time and it's very difficult to realize sometimes what you're supposed to be doing, and it feels frustrating. And at that point, you start to feel like, well, maybe it's padding it a little by making this a bit more obscure. But yeah, I think that's always subjective. I think because person to person, some people will see the woods, some people will see the trees, some people will see neither, sort of thing. And,
Right.
yeah, it's just everyone's tuned into these things differently. And I find that sometimes where like you feel very clever figuring out one puzzle, and then you don't see something that's bland, fucking obvious. Like it's the way it is. But yeah, it's like it's no different from any other those sort of games of that ilk, especially in the 2D sort of horror-y platformer puzzlers. Nothing will ever be as terribly frustrating as Hearts of Darkness. So it doesn't matter. Yeah, like, we've always gone up from there. That's all that matters.
I'm going to take a page out of your book and just give a last-minute shout-out to the score for this game, which is by Tobias Lilja and Christian Vasselbring. And I still find that the score, in this last week is just like, again, the perfect kind of score that is very reflective of both the war, the sort of like industrial horrors of the environment design, but also just overall like the thematic darkness that again feels like very reminiscent of other types of like dark fantasy that maybe are more young adult skewing, sort of again along the lines of like a Coraline type of thing. That's kind of like my barometer for what I'm talking about here. And this kind of feels like an extension of that particular corner of horror. But yeah, in terms of like this being a game also, I guess, that is like T-rated, not that we usually, delve much into, the ratings of games or like what that does. But like, I think that for this particular type of storytelling, like it really is a terrific example of like a smart use of a T rating, right? For as much as some people bemoan that type of experience and, saying that it neuters the horror, what have you, like this I always found was perfectly in line with its ratings in terms of like the types of scares and whatnot, while at the same time, keeping in mind that protagonist, like being a child, like it is just as much terrifying and threatening as if it was an M-rated game, and but you don't have to watch the kid get torn to pieces or what have you. I don't think that would add much to the type of experience that it is, or make it much more of an effective one at that.
Yeah, I think it's that great example of just like cutting it or fading at just the right moment sort of thing. There's a couple where you are just like kind of left thinking, are they going to go there? Like, because especially with the chefs, there's one way you can get caught and about to basically hit you with a meat cleaver, and it's just like it fades at the last possible second sort of thing like that, and it's you kind of think that like you're just going to catch it, and I like that. That's sort of they could have faded a lot earlier, and it would have been understandable. But yeah, that they do push the boundaries nicely, and I think that's what made it also so accessible to a wider audience as well, because it's got that look that looks like things like we've talked about, that are sort of friendly to younger audiences. And given that in the last decade or so we've had a lot of horror games sort of skew towards a younger audience, building up like this lore, whether it be laid out in front of them or theorized and discussed online. It's Little Nightmares is a very good example of that in terms of giving you enough to sort of look at and understand, but also give you room to sort of go, oh, but what if, or what and have discussion about what could this mean, what could that, and that's what I prefer out of horror games. Like if you can do that without having to explain it to everyone and being like page upon page of lore like on the internet for people to find out what the backstory is. It's kind of cooler when stuff is just born of like general discussion, and we don't have to have like devs explaining themselves because they don't need to. It's like that's art is subjective, and that's the great thing. You can interpret it however you want. Like you may not be technically right, but you still got something out of it that goes beyond what the developers maybe even thought, which is great.
That was something again that we briefly touched upon in our chat with the developer, in that it's they love to see, fan theories and things, and it makes them view their work in new lenses in a way that they themselves maybe even didn't at times, and find these theories and whatnot. And again, like, I find that art that is able to conjure up those types of discussions and theories and whatnot, like, that's half the fun about exploring those types of worlds, is that you get to see what it means to other people and different interpretations. And sometimes, those interpretations might be completely batshit nuts compared to what you yourself might think, but that speaks to works of art that ultimately, that can have that many interpretations. That ends up being more interesting than just like this black and white reading of something. And once you get that answer, it's like, yeah, there's not much more to pick off of those bones, so to speak. But I think that ultimately, like, yeah, those types of worlds are the most intriguing ones, and the ones that I think also, like, in terms of thinking about like this jump from Little Nightmares to Reanimal, a lot of the techniques, I suppose, that they used in Little Nightmares in regards to like the storytelling or world building that we're mentioning, like those are things that they can continue to refine and utilize here and have completely different results, because it's not overly reliant on like exactly what worked for the previous one. And so I think that that's one of those things that, again, it makes me excited to check out Reanimal in the new year and whatnot. But yeah, I guess if we just want to leave with one final question for you, Neil, what do you still think is like the best lesson that other combatless horror games can maybe learn from Little Nightmares 1 or 2?
I think it does just come back to the idea of using your visuals for good, and it was true of Inside as it is of this. I will couple them together because of the proximity, but they were the right way to go. And there are many games from this time period where they definitely took the wrong ideas out of it, over-explained things, had a lot of text. Maybe they didn't have voice acting, but they had to explain stuff away in that text, and that's fine to a degree. But I think games like this do very much show that you can. It's a visual medium, so use that. Really do something with it that, especially in the limitations of like a 2D or 2.5D sort of look, where you can show a lot of detail from screen to screen as it is, rather than having to worry about that sort of open world. And yeah, lots of developers get that still, obviously. But the stronger examples very much are like this, where you just have such a real strong visual identity, and it just helps so much in terms of telling your story about time and a place.
Absolutely. And we'll see how that sort of like approach continues to evolve with, Tarsier Studios' next endeavor. But that's going to do it for our chat this week on Little Nightmares. And as always, friend, it's a pleasure chatting horror with you for Safe Room.
Back at you, but until next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Safe Room. If you've enjoyed our horror discussions, please rate and review the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify. For show updates and additional content, you can follow us on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube at Safe Room Pod. Additionally, you can join our Safe Room Podcast Discord to chat with us and other horror fans about the genre we all love. And finally, you can send emails to saferoompod@gmail.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on a game we have or are about to cover. Thanks again for listening, and be sure to check out our episode of Horror Bites out this Thursday. And until then, we'll see you guys for a main feed episode next Monday.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.